Hello, my name is Kayla, and I've been helping with the New Berlin Building Pretzel Potential Community Engagement Sessions. Community Engagement Session number 3 was held in person at the New Berlin Junior Senior High. All community members are invited to these events. This video is a synopsis of what we went over. First, we had a brief review of the first and second sessions. At the first community engagement session, we went over the facilities assessment. You can access the original presentation for Community Engagement number 1 on our website. At our second community engagement session, we began to ask you to look at those main issues we found in our facilities assessment and begin to look to the future and ask what you would call the perfect school for the New Berlin School District. This is another in-depth presentation that can be found on our website. This second session was also the first time the community was able to review our scenarios that were created with the task force. The input we received that night dictated what we worked on over winter break and what I'm going to show you today. That night, there was one idea that sung from all the community members. Overall, there seemed to be a consensus of that something big needs to happen to get this school back in shape. However, what exactly is that and what are our limits? Naturally, one large limitation that we want to review is our financing. At our in-person meeting, Tom Crabtree from Stiefel walked us through the following slides. I'm going to give you a brief overview of what he discussed. We first took a look at outstanding debt from the previous project, the elementary. What we found overall is that we're close to paying off our past bond issue. Meaning a bond issue for a good-sized project for the junior and senior high could mean little to no tax impact for property owners, depending on the size of our project. This is what Tom called puzzle piece number 1. Puzzle piece number 2 is something fairly new for Sangamon County, and that is the county facility sales tax. Revenue from this sales tax can only be used towards facilities improvements. This funding can be used in small batches towards bite-sized projects at a school, or can be lumped in with a bond issue towards a larger project. Overall, this revenue is ongoing, and while we're applying a sales tax towards a large project, it does not mean we will not receive future funds for future projects. One particular limiting constraint is the bottom left-hand corner. The state gives us a debt limitation. Based on the assessed value of the district is allowed to borrow 13.8% of that amount. In total, that's almost $28 million for us. With that, we removed the existing debt that we still have, giving us an allowed $24 million that we can borrow, and that is our borrowing capacity. So these next 4 slides will look fairly similar to each other. What all 4 slides will show is our 2 puzzle pieces. Our 2 forms of funding, which is the sales tax and the property tax bonds. What we will vary between the 4 slides are a series of variables that we can make conservative assumptions to get a proper estimate of funding. First off, there's some variables we don't know, such as interest rate. What we know right now is that interest rates are historically low, which is good for us. But for our estimates, we want to be conservative and hypothesize that interest rates may go up in the next few months. Of course, it's not something we want to happen, but we will work towards getting the lowest interest rate. But estimating a high rate is something we want to be prepared for. And then there are other variables that we do have control over, and are the choices that we make when choosing how we're going to repay these bonds. In the same fashion as going into the bank for a house loan, you know generally how much your income is, what your budget is, and what you can afford to pay monthly for mortgage. One thing you can discuss with your bank is what you think your income increase will be at your job. The same is true when we talk about the sales tax and property tax piece. We expect that the sales tax revenue will go up over time, but how much? Again, we want to be reasonable and conservative in this estimate. But if we're too conservative, then we put too much burden on the property taxpayers. We hope and expect that the assessed value of the district, which is the driver of collecting property taxes, goes up over time. But we have to make a solid assumption. So these are some of the choices that we have to make to say where we're comfortable at in our estimates. These choices can be seen in the upper left-hand corner of these upcoming 4 slides. First off, we're setting this bond issue at a 20-year repayment. On the third and fourth charts, you'll see that you're looking at a 25 repayment option, which is something you, the community, can help the board decide what you're comfortable with. Then we assume a conservative 1% growth in EAV and no growth in sales tax. We find that 1 to 2% increase in EAV is a fairly good assumption since, historically, our numbers for EAV have been between 1% to 4%, which are numbers that you can see in the last slide. After setting our variables, we can then look at what our charts are showing. Starting with the far left red column, we have our sales tax income, and then 5 options that correlate with the project scenarios that we'll be discussing later in this presentation. So if we assume no growth in sales tax, we can garner $8 million overall that could go into any of the options. So what you'll see in the lower graph is that all options start with a red bar, which is sales tax, and then different green, purple, blue, and orange colors that correspond to the property tax bonds. For the tax bonds, we borrow exactly what we need in addition to the sales tax to fund the corresponding project scenario, which in turn affects the tax rates, either lowering them, keeping them the same, or raising the tax rate. So for this page, we have a range of a decrease in tax rates of 62 cents to an increase of 29 cents. So next, if we stick with the 20-year repayment, but have a 2% growth in EAV and a 1% growth in sales tax, we find that many options could see a decrease in tax impact and only a slight increase in tax rates for the priciest option, number 4. And then for this slide and the next one, we look at a 25-year repayment term. For this slide, we revert back to a 1% growth in EAV and no growth in sales tax. With that, since it's a longer repayment, we do have some additional funds in sales tax. And for this 4th slide, we still have conservative numbers, but this slide is the most progressive slide of them all, with our variables set at 25-year repayment, 2% growth in EAV, and 1% growth in sales tax. One thing that I haven't focused on in any of these slides is option 5. Over winter break, we asked Tom what these numbers would look like if we assumed no tax rate impact was put on property owners. What would be our allowable project funds then? Overall, with the sales tax and bond issue, we found that we could get $29 million to $36 million in project funds. With that, what you'll see later in this presentation is a project that can fit within those budget boundaries while also providing as much functional improvement to the building that we can provide. These next few slides are backup data that Tom has provided us. This video will skim over these slides quickly, so please take a look at the PDF of our presentation so you can have a more in-depth look at this data. Over winter break, we have continued to work with staff and students to understand what the right school looks like for the New Berlin School District. In early December, we took New Berlin staff around a nearby school so they could see what it means to have a cafetorium, info commons, or just to study what light remodeling versus major remodeling looks like. We took the time to not only visit the physical spaces, but ask the school staff how they used the space. This eventually spawned another meeting where we discussed New Berlin's curriculum and how it would improve if given a 21st century school facility. Pleasant Plains High School has spent the past 20 years remodeling the oldest portions of the building and adding on key spaces such as a cafetorium, info commons, and competition gym. What we learned from Pleasant Plains is just the amount a library can transform from not only being a space to store stacks, but a central hub to the school that can be utilized throughout the day. Athens Junior and Senior High School lightly remodeled most of their building and added on a shop and a gym. They accomplished this because of how young their building For us, simply adding on a couple of needed spaces will not be a successful investment. But with that being said, we wanted the staff to see how their recently added shop and gym functioned. Many ideas that sprang from the Athens shop area were inspiration that could be applied throughout our building, making many spaces available and flexible to a variety of activities ranging from woodworking to engineering to FACS. The staff found Tri-Valley to be the closest example as to how they envisioned their school to function for their curriculum. At Tri-Valley, the original 1977 building was fully gutted and remodeled with a heavy focus on collaboration, STEM, and flexibility. A gym, fine arts, and secure entry were added to the building. There's a circular hallway that creates a simple traffic flow throughout. Much of the New Berlin staff began to notice the fluidity of the spaces around the cafeteria and media center. They didn't just function for one portion of the day, but could be useful and worked in so many ways. Existing 1977 building that hosted the cafeteria and media center. We went to view the Music Commons that houses both band and choir, along with acting as a backstage area for their theater. The last spaces we visited was the PE gym, renovated locker room area, and indoor concessions area that can operate for both gym and field events. Many of the staff saw the space as useful for New Berlin in many ways. The simplest of improvements being the PE gym. While this gym does not have typical wood athletic flooring or bleachers, it's still a useful space for PE practices or smaller athletic events for their community. After the exemplar tours, Todd, Jill, and the New Berlin staff sat down to discuss what courses or portions of their curriculum were available and supported, unsupported, and desired curriculum that they would like to make available for their students. The chart shown on the screen shows the number of courses that the staff placed in each category. The bars on the right side of the screen show the amount of 21st century curriculum that is not being supported by the building. Overall, students are experiencing learning loss in this building. Lessons within required curriculum are being skipped because of the lack of physical space for collaboration among students. Students lose focus due to temperature variations in classrooms and the noise levels of poor functioning HVAC units. Student work is being destroyed by roof leaks continuing to pop up throughout the building. Instruction time is lost as students and staff fight a building that doesn't have storage, utilities, or space to allow that instruction to happen. Students enter the class agitated and stressed as they fight through crowded and winding hallways. This input is not only coming from the staff. Students in U.S. history spoke on improvements they would want to see at their school. Many requests were sobering to hear. There were requests for simple human needs like proper heating and cooling and a roof that doesn't leak. They provided informative points as to why it would improve the learning environment and understand how large of an investment some of these decisions will be. Past the simple ones for proper shelter, they know the ever-growing issues that a school faces in the 21st century, but also issues that they face as a district that covers so much land. Requests that may not seem as high priority, such as a student lounge, is an understandable need for students that drive long hours and can't go home between school and practices. This continues on to the outdoors facilities. Many projects they proposed had reasonings and benefits that could improve multiple functions throughout the school. So why did I bring this up? I want to continue to remind you as to why we're here. Our first goal, a goal that students are lobbying to see, is to provide a proper learning environment for our students. I've given you reminders from both myself, staff, and students as to why an improved facility could mean an improved learning environment. But it's understandable that you may want some more definitive information to the subject. With that, it was requested at the last meeting to provide the exact research we've used while designing schools towards improving student learning. I've included a handful of scholarly papers published in the last 10 years. That also includes a study from BLDD in 2017. For example, our study from BLDD wanted to see how the built environment affected student attendance, discipline, and achievement at Washington High School, Eisenhower High School, and Charles City. In many cases, there were improvements. But with that being said, all of these studies, including ours, has an understanding that the built environment isn't an end-all be-all for student achievement. However, every study has found that the built environment can harm or help the students and staff that inhabit that space. Overall, the built environment will never be a singular golden ticket to making a successful school, but it is a useful tool within the whole toolbox that helps support student achievement. And with that, we're at the main portion of the meeting where we review the scenarios. Before we dive into them, I'm going to explain some of the data that is presented with every scenario. First off, we will tell you the first cost, which is the cost that it will take to design and construct any of the scenarios. Then we'll list operational costs, which are costs it takes to operate and maintain the building for the next 30 years. When you add those two costs together, you'll get the life cycle costs, or the overall costs you'll spend on the building for the next 30 years from the start of construction. As shown on this example, the colors of this floor plan and pie chart show the most cost of the work is allocated to repairs and updates that we called out in our physical needs assessment. The green in the pie chart shows the costs it'll take to change or update the surrounding pavement. We'll show you the total square footage of the building, and we'll give you an averaged building age of the elementary, junior and senior high school, and the district as a whole. These numbers are almost like a grade on whether or not we successfully removed or heavily updated the oldest portions of the building that cannot function as a future-focused school. And last but definitely not least, we will be taking the first costs, operating costs, and functional performances to get a cost-benefit ratio, or CBR. This is how we grade the buildings to see if we get as much bang for our buck. For example, there are a handful of scenarios that are fairly cheap, but the updates are so minimal that it misses many big issues such as corridor travel, cafeteria space, and room for staff and student collaboration. So even though the scenarios are cheap, they have a bad CBR since we're not using our money to the best of our capability. And if any of you are new to this, these numbers all came out of Clio, a software created by BLDD. We have a handful of informational videos and pamphlets online that I can send you if you're curious about learning more. It's time to dive into the scenarios. Scenarios 1 through 4 are all scenarios that we previewed in community engagement number 2. We did not want anyone to feel like they had to make decisions that night, so we only requested the community members to write down their pros and cons to each scenario and if they generally liked or disliked the scenario. From there, we reviewed the comments to see if there's any improvements we can make to the scenarios before we ask you to pick a final scenario that will be presented to the board and put on the ballot in the spring. Scenario 1 and 2, while low in first costs, were fairly disliked among the groups, specifically due to the low CBRs and not successfully improving enough issues throughout the building. So the team focused our studies on scenario 3 and 4 to understand what the community liked and what could be improved. As I've already mentioned, the only pros to scenario 1 is that it has the lowest costs. But even so, the money we're spending is not improving the functionality of the space to improve the CBR, leaving us with less money and not much noticeable improvement to our building. So scenario 1, or status quo, keeps all portions of the existing building and improves the space by accomplishing all needs called out in physical needs assessment. A small addition is provided near the high school office to create a secure entry. While the costs of this first scenario are low, the community realizes that it only fixes the bare minimum at a high cost for small improvement and functionality. Same as scenario 1, scenario 2 has low costs, but even still does not accomplish enough functional improvements to give it a proper CPR. Another issue that comes up with heavy remodel scenarios is a concern of construction disrupting the learning environment and a need to phase it over a series of summers. This is an issue that can be minimized if planned correctly, but will always be relevant in scenarios that require heavy remodels. In scenario 2, the southwestern wing of the building is removed as it is some of the oldest portions of the building. Major remodels are focused on poor functioning areas of the building, including the round junior high classroom and the kitchen cafeteria area. All other existing areas get improvements as called out in our physical needs assessment. A gym, classroom, offices, and secure entry and cafetorium and combined band and chorus rooms are added around the 1970s portion of the building. Scenario 3 is the first scenario we found that takes a heavy jump into truly improving a good amount of the issues that resonate in the space. This scenario keeps the dome and has been a hot topic for all of our meetings. In scenario 3, the poorest functioning areas of the building, including the southwestern wing and circular classroom area, is removed. The 1950s and 1960s southeastern wing of the building receives heavy remodeling to perform as the high school academic wing. A large addition is added near the dome that includes a gym, junior high classrooms, and cafetorium, and classrooms that can be shared between the junior high and high school. Note that the addition area has been tweaked slightly to try to keep a singular stretch of circulation across the building and to minimize travel time as much as possible. Moving on to scenario 4. This is the only scenario where we discussed building brand new. While the costs are at the highest, it's also the only scenario that includes all of the spaces that a future-focused school typically has. The placement of the building remains to the west of the track to keep it nearby the elementary and existing roads on the property. The bus barn has been moved to the south to keep it away from the elementary area as requested from the community members. And all that leaves us is scenario 5. But if you've been keeping track, we didn't have a scenario 5 last time. There were a lot of feedback and requests we received from our second community engagement session that we couldn't accomplish by simply tweaking scenario 1 through 4. So we've created a scenario that encompasses many of the concerns that came up from the engagement session. Before I show you the design, I wanted to discuss the main goals for this scenario. First off, this scenario improves the learning environment and functionality as much as possible without changing the tax rates. It also minimizes construction disruption and phasing as much as possible. However, as I've mentioned, it will always be of some concern for remodel projects. In scenario 5, we make a clean break with any portion of the building that is older than 1970. This allows us to keep one of the most sentimental areas, the dome, without having too many issues that arise when remodeling buildings over 60 years old. Not only that, but the 1970s addition is fairly open structurally, which should alleviate some restrictions or issues we could run into when remodeling that space, allowing us to successfully remodel the cafeteria and circular classroom area into something useful for our school. Starting with the dome, which is in yellow. This space is in decent enough shape to where we can get away with performing physical needs improvements alone. Moving to the east, the center of the circular classroom area is blown out to become a multi-use media center. This makes a fair use of the space since media centers don't tend to have such a restriction on size and shape of the space. Breakout collaboration rooms, book stacks, or study nooks are just a handful of useful spaces within a media center that could fit into any of the odd nooks and crannies that form in a circular pie shape. This space also includes a new FACS room that sits adjacent to a remodeled kitchen. There's also room for STEM and Ag classrooms, which is nice to have nearby the new shop addition that sits just south of this area. Just beside the shop area is a music commons. Within the music commons is a small stage that could host performances for roughly 300 people. We've also included some additional rooms so chorus can have its own space. giving us more flexibility in scheduling that scenarios 2 and 3 couldn't accomplish with their shared band and chorus room. At the heart of the building is a remodeled cafeteria and kitchen that is connected to the main two-story addition surrounding the dome. This two-story addition contains most of the classrooms for the junior and senior high, keeping most of the teaching staff near each other. However, that does not mean there are cramped hallways due to a concentration of students. The wide and circular corridor that goes around the dome will allow student traffic to disperse into various routes, easing some of the hallway woes students experience today. The north portion of this two-story addition has new locker rooms on the first floor and a weight room on the second, allowing access to these locker rooms from both gyms and track and football field. Just beside this is a gym that is tucked in between the dome and circular media center. This is the first scenario that is cheaper than scenario 4, has a slightly lower functional performance, but has a higher cost-benefit ratio than scenario 4. This is due to a number of factors. We completely renovate any remaining existing building. Those renovations will not only improve functionality, but are being applied to an existing portion of the building that's flexible enough to accommodate those changes without astronomical budgets. It will be less of a fight when it comes to remodeling this space, allowing us to apply the rest of the budget towards an addition that houses all core academic spaces, extremely improving our functionality while still keeping costs lower, therefore giving us the best bang for our buck and the highest CBR. So what I just presented to you is a verbatim presentation we had at Community Engagement number 3. As we worked through our activities later that night with the community, we found many community members had this as their top vote, but they had a handful of tweaks that they saw important for this plan to work. Since that meeting, we have been studying the scenario and finding solutions to make sure it is laid out properly. These changes will be presented in full at Community Engagement Session number 4. As we have in the past, we've included a chart that compares the scenarios' main data points side by side. And with that, the community began small group work. Their first activity was to vote for their favorite and second favorite scenarios. Their second activity was to begin thinking of additional improvements to the surrounding campus that we would like to include in our master plan. We will have one more chance for the community to vote on their favorite scenario, which has dwindled down to 2 main concepts, including scenario 5 with its changes. We will also discuss a game plan for our master plan and how we can fund additional campus improvements no matter what scenario we pick. I hope to see you at our final community engagement session, CES number 4. It'll be held at the junior and senior high, but this time it'll be held in the dome. It'll be on Saturday, February 19th from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. We will likely provide refreshments starting at 8:30, but it may vary what we can do as we monitor COVID regulations. Everyone within New Berlin School District is invited to come. Feel free to bring your kids and invite your neighbors to the event. Thank you.